Good morning to everyone who's joined so far. I'm just waiting while the other participants log in. I can see the numbers going up, so I'm going to just give it a minute before we start. Okay, I'm going to get started. So welcome to Trilog's fourth webinar in our series. Today we're looking at what corporates can learn from philanthropy's response to the pandemic. I'm just going to start with a bit of overview of the technology. We've disabled the chat functionality, but the Q&A functionality is active. And I would encourage everyone to use that and to ask questions throughout the session. We've got over half of the session dedicated to responding to those questions. So when you do enter a question, please make it short so that I can get through them. And also please direct it to one or more of the speakers so that I can direct the questions in the Q&A session. The other point to make is that we are recording the session, and the slides and the recording and the write-up of the session will be made available. They will be sent to all participants, and they will be also put onto the Trilog Knowledge Hub. Then finally, there's a short survey that we'd like you to do. You can either do it directly after the session, or the link will be sent to you following the session. It's very quick, just ask a few questions, and we really appreciate your feedback, because we do use it when we structure the format, and also we've had some nice ideas coming through of what topics you'd like to see us cover in the future. Okay, so we'll move on then to the, there's a lot of new people. We had over 200 people sign up for this morning. And so I just want to give a very brief overview of Trilog. Trilog's a consultancy, a small consultancy that focuses purely on responsible business. Our tagline is supporting better business, and our mission really is to help companies to become more responsible and sustainable. We do this through two main means. The first is consulting or advisory services, and the second is knowledge sharing. On the consulting side, and specifically related to corporate social investment, our two main areas are helping organizations with their CSI strategies and the implementation of those strategies. And in fact, we've just recently launched a new process to assist companies to adjust their CSI strategies based on everything that's happened this year. Obviously, the environment has changed massively. And the other main area of consulting that we do is monitoring and evaluation. And here we help to build monitoring and evaluation frameworks, and we also do project reviews and evaluations. On the knowledge sharing platforms, this is obviously one of them. We've also got our annual Trilog Business and Society Conference that was due to happen in April physically, but it's been moved to a virtual conference on the 13th and 14th of October. And so I'd encourage you, we have actually opened the registration. We haven't marketed that yet, but we've moved to a virtual platform. We've selected the platform, we've started to build it, and we're pretty excited about the opportunities it's presenting, both for the content, but also for the networking abilities that it has. The next knowledge sharing platform is the Trilog Business and Society Handbook. I think a lot of you are aware of that. It used to be called the CSI Handbook, and we're right in the thick of producing this year's version. So if you haven't yet, please do participate in the surveys, the primary research. There's a survey for nonprofits and there's a survey for corporates. And then our most recent knowledge sharing platform is the Trilog Knowledge Hub, which is a freely available online portal that has a lot of information on different developmental sectors. The information is not just Trilog info. We collate information from various sources. There's case studies, research, evaluations, interviews. So, and I'd like to take this opportunity, the picture you can actually see on the slide is a screenshot of the philanthropy page or the philanthropy section of the Knowledge Hub, which is sponsored by Nedbank Private Wealth. And we actually have Knox from Nedbank Private Wealth as one of our panelists. So I want to take this opportunity to thank them for sponsoring that topic on the Knowledge Hub. And again, the recordings and this presentation will be put onto that topic on the Knowledge Hub after this session. Okay, so the structure of this morning is I'm going to give a brief overview, and then we're going to hear opening statements from our three panelists. We have three great experts on philanthropy and who've really been in the thick of it in responding to this crisis. So we're going to hear their experiences. We have Sarah Rennie, who's the chairperson of the Independent Philanthropy Association of South Africa. Then we have Knox Fangwani, who's the head of philanthropy at Nedbank Private Wealth, and Vuyiswa Sidzumo, who's the senior program officer at Ford Foundation in South Africa. So they'll each give an opening statement, and then, as I said, more than half of the session will be dedicated to Q&A. So do enter your questions as we're going through. There's also a hashtag at the bottom. So for those of you that are on Twitter, Philanthropy Forum, and Trilog is at Trilogs SA on Twitter, if you want to tag us. Okay, so just a bit of background why we're looking at this. I think the philanthropic response to this pandemic and the social and economic crisis that has followed lockdown has really been massive, and not only from philanthropic organizations and foundations, but also from companies and individuals. So this just gives a few of the figures. The Center for Disaster Philanthropy in the US and Canada, they've been tracking various grants, and they globally have tracked $12.4 billion worth of giving to relief since the start of the pandemic. And that was as at mid-July. And of that huge amount, 65% was from corporates. They've been tracking grants to South African recipients and in South Africa as well. And the total there was $307 million from those funders, with a few of the recipients, including the South Africa Future Trust, the Solidarity Response Trust Fund, and Africa Check. And then locally, I think we've seen also a huge response by corporates, foundations, as well as individuals. Just as one example, the Solidarity Fund since March has raised 2.9 billion Rand by mid-July. And the vast majority of this, 94%, comes from companies and foundations, but still a significant amount being committed from individuals. So the giving's been huge, and I think it's been a lot more rapid than we've seen in prior years. So what we want to look at today are what are some of the changes that have happened in terms of how companies and foundations give, and how can we look at these and decide what's worth taking forward into in terms of giving practice. Okay, so a few pointers, and we're going to go into these more detail, the speakers will, but just some of the things that I think that early learnings that are coming out. The first is around partnership and collaboration, and this is a topic that is always talked about and has always been talked about at our conferences, and I think we've really seen some great real life examples through the response to this pandemic. Not only foundations and funders collaborating with each other, but also cross sector. So with companies involved as well. And I think this has particularly been prevalent in the kind of healthcare sector. A nice example is the Elma South Africa Foundation, who's worked with DG Murray Trust, Johnson & Johnson, a company, and various other private foundations to provide PPE and support to South Africa's 120,000 community healthcare workers. But there are lots of other examples, and it is a topic that we will go into in this session. The next is around the increase in giving we've seen, and also the rapid deployment of funds. One of the collaborative funding platforms we've seen is from the Open Society Foundation in South Africa, that's worked with civil society as well as various layers of government to provide rapid response grants to a number of civil society organizations. I think a lot of funders have supported new types of organizations, new projects in their response. And one of the things we need to consider going forward is to what degree does it make sense to continue funding these, to scale them up? And that's part of looking beyond our immediate response at what do we take forward in terms of our giving. And then the last point I've just made is around impact investing. Obviously, this is something that has been growing for many years prior to COVID, but we've also seen a ramp up in this since the pandemic and the response to it. And there's an example of the Gates Foundation with Welcome and MasterCard, again, collaborating and making $125 million available to organizations for equitable access to treatment and for treatment to reach poorer communities. Okay, so I wanted to, at this point, just, I think, yeah, many people have logged on now. We do have well over 100. So I'm going to run the first poll while I move on to the next slide. Just to get a sense from our participants, what is the main change? And unfortunately, you're only allowed to select one on these Zoom polls, but what is the main change in giving practice that you have experienced either as a funder or a recipient of funding? So none, you haven't seen any changes. Changes in the magnitude of funding, increased non-financial, more unrestricted, better flexibility, greater collaboration, etc. I'm going to give it a few more seconds as I see the answers coming in. And these different changes in giving practice, again, we'll go into, we'll hear from our panelists on how their organizations have either applied these or not. Okay, so I see that over 70% of you have voted. So I'm going to end the polling now and share the results. And it's quite evenly spread, as you can see, but the highest category there, 20%, is changes in the amounts or magnitudes of funding. But also what's good to see there is what looks like second is more consultation between funders and recipients. And I think that's been one of the positive outcomes of the response to this crisis. Okay, so I'm going to ask our panelists just to consider some of those responses when they give their opening statements. Okay, I've mentioned some of these guidelines for support in the previous webinars for those that have been on, and I'm sure the panelists will speak to some of them too. The first is around making grants as unrestricted as possible. And I think for many funders, this is a kind of new and almost scary concept in terms of handing over that the flexibility and the ability to use funds where they're most needed. I was actually on a webinar last week with the Center for Effective Philanthropy in the US, and the CEO of that said, you know, they've been encouraging this unrestricted funding for many years, and why has it taken a pandemic for it to happen? But again, I think it's one of the positive outcomes of the response to this crisis. Related to that is around timing and deliverables and adjusting those in consultation with your partners. Wherever possible, to not withhold funds or claim them back, even if the activities aren't occurring. Many organizations are adjusting their activities or conducting different things that are needed in this time. Something that we've said in all of them also is supporting partners in their advocacy efforts. And that doesn't have to be financial support. That can be adding your voice to whatever the issue is that they're advocating for, or financial support for research, which can assist with advocacy. And I think there's been a lot coming out on about supporting and listening to communities and to organizations on the ground and supporting community-led organizations. Okay, so that's it from me in terms of the intro. And I'm going to hand over to our panelists. Let me just stop sharing that. So I'm going to start with Sarah from APASA. And the opening question for her is really around, there hasn't been that much support from government for nonprofits during this pandemic and the response to the pandemic. So how have philanthropists and foundations in South Africa stepped in to support nonprofits and address this funding gap? You on mute, so let me unmute you. There we go.
Great. Thanks, Kathy, and thank you for inviting me onto this webinar. I'm going to try to be brief because I know I've got about 5 minutes or so. So I think I really want to make 3 points. The first one is I think that philanthropy in all its guises, so both the more formal and established philanthropy that the Independent Philanthropy Association of South Africa, PASA, represent, but as well as more informal philanthropy, which would be represented by ordinary South Africans who are digging deep into their purses every day to help causes close to their heart or to help people that they know. So I think all forms of philanthropy have responded in a bold and immediate way. There have been constraints, but the response has absolutely been immediate and with a deep understanding of the impact that this pandemic has caused on nonprofits and on a wide variety of sectors. So there have been a number of big and quick donations, the ones that get the press, and we've seen those. Some very big donations have not received a lot of press coverage, but there certainly have been some huge commitments from some of the more established philanthropists. You mentioned Alma Philanthropies, Oppenheimer Generations, the Michael and Susan Dull Foundation, the Alan Gray ecosystem, and on it goes. They have done that. There's also been, and our experience at IPASA has been that there's been an incredible desire to connect, to gather information, to understand what's happening in communities and on the ground.
I think we've lost Sarah there. Give her a minute. Or alternatively, Knox, I'm going to move over to you and we'll come back to Sarah when she comes back online. So Knox is the head of philanthropy at Nedbank Private Wealth. And I'd like her to just tell all of us how Nedbank Private Wealth's approach to giving has changed during the pandemic. Thanks, Knox.
Thanks, Kathy. Good morning, and thank you for having me. Within Nedbank Private Wealth, our focus has been education for a long time, and that has remained during this time so far. So we have not moved away from that, notwithstanding other urgent needs that have surfaced as a result of the pandemic, including food security. Instead, our approach has been to strengthen efforts within the education space to provide support to learners and educators from home who we all know have missed a lot of contact time, and some continue to miss out on contact time. Very early on in the crisis, right at the start of lockdown, we had the opportunity to support one of our existing partners, the NECT, who needed to pivot to providing materials and curate content to learners and teachers at home during the lockdown period. And so our support to them was very specific to curating content to be disseminated via these new alternative channels, including television and radio. Collaboration and aligning with the national agenda is something that's always been important for us to ensure scale and long-term sustainability, which is something that you mentioned earlier on in the intro. And this initiative that we supported through the NECT was in support of the DBE's national response plan. So it resonated well with us within the business. Although this was new terrain, we've never really had a focus on digital or alternative channels in the past. So it was new terrain for us, it was untested, and really no one knew, including the partner, which channel to focus on, which was going to work well. But we're willing to take the risk, we had to take the risk, and we're willing to learn with the partner. I think the risk of doing nothing during a disaster or a pandemic, the consequences are always greater. So we were willing to take the risk and really provide the support right up front. So in summary, Kathy, we have stuck to our focus of education, but rather exploring how best to support efforts within education during this time. We've taken definitely a lot more risk than we have in the past. We've always treated very cautiously, and we've had to move very quickly in making decisions, which really also pushed us out of our comfort zone. And we've had to trust our partner a lot more. and really shift more power to them, and really let them take the lead. So I think there's been a lot of learnings for us and a lot of adjusting in terms of how we work and support our partners during this time. And however, I do need to highlight that although within private wealth we've had a really focused or stuck to our focus area, within the group there's been a slightly different stance. We're looking at sort of other needs, including healthcare, as well as food security, amongst others. So within private wealth, we've really stuck to education, but rather changed how we have partnered and supported our beneficiaries in the past.
Thanks, Knox. Yeah, all sounds eminently sensible to me. Sticking to your area, but changing how you've gone about your giving and some of the areas that you're supporting within that area. And I think one of the things that we'll take into the discussion is to what degree this new type of changing, so, you know, the greater risk, I mean, the new type of giving, the greater risk, the quicker giving, the more trust, to what extent do you think that's going to persist post the pandemic? I see we have Sarah back online, so I'm going to jump back to you. You had made your point about the huge increase in giving, and also you were talking about how many funders have been much more consultative and looking to hear from the communities.
Thanks, Kathy. Apologies for that. That was ESCOM where I'm at. So I wanted to just make those 2 points and then move quickly on to a kind of snapshot of the timeline in terms of the type of response. So we saw within the APASA community and more broadly as well within the philanthropy community, the first response really looked on general medical emergency humanitarian. So there was a big push and a lot of discussion around how we could support medical needs, and a lot of consultation with the Solidarity Fund in that regard. The second kind of wave of response really focused on 2 areas. One was support to existing partners, and that related to much of what you've already spoken to, which was about engaging and understanding impact, establishing guidelines for our members in the greater philanthropy community on how to respond, and providing where members could top up an emergency grants that related to COVID-specific issues. For example, data, additional costs around cleaning. There was also a great concentration and effort to understand the food needs. There was discussion around vouchers versus food parcels, an understanding of which NGOs nationally were best placed to provide food support. And then we definitely saw a shift into what Knox has described as the key strategic area of focus for that particular foundation. So they went back to their kind of key focus area and said, what does it mean for us in the environment, in social justice, in understanding the particular effects? And I know Ford really understands this so well around the impact on gender-based violence during the pandemic, and education. How do we understand what it means for learners not to be at school, and how we can support both the government as well as NPOs and learners in schools in that situation. You mentioned some emergency funding that was being made available. I think there was also Oppenheimer Generation supported the CAF emergency funding. I think it was quite limited to food and Gauteng. There was some other emergency funding, I think, through Mergen Foundation, but probably not enough, given that most foundations were focused more on their existing partners and understanding the impact there. But I would also just like to say lastly that the funding gap and the pressure on foundations to provide funding in a very uncertain financial environment, I might add, hasn't only been towards NPOs. Foundations support many other entities over and above NPOs, for example, small, medium enterprises, entrepreneurs, schools, communications campaigns that have been a big part of the pandemic as well. And so there's been a huge demand on funding. And I think one of the challenges for foundations has been how to make these difficult decisions with the limited resources that they have.
Thanks, Sarah. And again, I think you've touched on some issues that we can go into more detail there, because you've made the very good point that there's such an increased demand on companies and foundations for funding, and yet with the economic downturn, there's often less funding available. So, what's the outlook for that, and to what degree are foundations dipping into endowments and looking at spending down at faster rates than they had previously? And on that note, I'm going to go to our third panelist, because I think Ford Foundation, there's been quite a bit written. Ford Foundation has responded boldly, globally. They've increased their giving significantly. They've changed their ways of giving, and I think they provide a great case study. So I'd like to hand over to Vuyiswa to tell us a little bit more about how Ford has responded and adapted its giving practices in response to COVID.
Thanks, Kathy. So Ford also used a couple of strategies, but I think similar to NetBank, we did not immediately, add on new strategies or change our current strategies. But we just, we kind of deepened how we were responding and made sure that we were responding very proactively to grantees. So there was, for instance, around March, communication that came from our executive vice president to all our partners globally, outlining how Ford was going to be, supporting them during this time. So, kind of reaching out and saying, if for those organizations, for an example, that would have been receiving project support, we were willing to convert those to unrestricted funding. And this is already, under the background that Ford is already giving about over 70% of its funding is general funding in any case. But we thought even beyond that, we extended that to all of our partners, and changing, for instance, if partners, for obvious reasons, many partners couldn't do the activities that they had planned to do. Some would have funding shortfalls. Some would need, to beef up on their technologies in order to allow staff to work from home. So it was really, responding to those kinds of detailed needs of partners. So we sent out that initial communication, and then we had calls, so each program officer would then reach out. But we were also conscious, though, that we were not being a nuisance to partners, that we were, they didn't have to be responding to Ford all the time. So we also changed our reporting to say, if you think that you're not going to be able to report, on the due date of the report, let us know. We're also flexible, and then we will meet you where you are. So you just let us know, and then we can decide how to do that. So it was really those kinds of practical things. And then we also did grant increases, because in some instances where, for an example, it may have been a final grant, we anticipated that those organizations, those may struggle down the line, given what Sarah was talking about in terms of reduced endowments and those kinds of challenges that other partners may be facing, particularly organizations that work in the human rights space, particularly on issues like advocacy and so on. So we increased grants and extended grant periods so that this would cushion organizations, down the line who are already anticipating, these challenges further down the line. And we also then responded to some of our partners, particularly those that make small grants at community-based level, because some of them were saying, we're getting requests from women who are on the front lines, or people who are just on the front lines of responding to in their communities, to make just sometimes even small grants. So we increased those grants very quickly. The turnaround was quite improved. I mean, in some instances, we could make a $250,000 increase in about a week. Then that would then enable our partners to then immediately be responding to the various needs. And I mean, we were just responding to them. We were not prescriptive, so the needs were vast. They were health related, there were issues related to food security and so on. And then we also then, Ford was also on the front lines of what then became the Philanthropy Pledge. You may have seen it, that was then signed up by the Council on Foundation. I think close to 800 foundations signed up to it, which was about, these practices that I was just talking about in terms of saying we pledge to, be responsive to our partners, to do this, and so on. So Ford was one of the, leading foundations to do that. And then lastly, we also responded to some of the immediate humanitarian needs, although that's not our area of focus, through our conversations with IPASA. We then also responded to, because we would have people presenting to IPASA members, we're also a member of IPASA. And then through that, then we identified a couple of, areas where we could respond. And we made, those kind of special grants, one-off, but as part of the immediate humanitarian relief response.
Thank you, Vuyiswa. I think you've touched on a lot of interesting areas there, and Ford really has come through this as a good example of how foundations have responded. I'm going to go to some questions, and I'll start with some from participants that I think are relevant to what you've spoken about. There's one here from Nomvula Dlamini saying, across the world, civil society organizations are calling for more flexible funding. We've heard all three of you touch on that point. The question is, beyond COVID-19, to what degree are donor agencies and foundations, or to what degree do you think that this will persist in the longer term? So I'm going to actually ask Knox and Vuyiswa to address that briefly, because Knox, you mentioned how, at your company, Nedbank Private Wealth, you have become more flexible and quicker and taking more risks. To what degree do you think that will persist? And then Vuyiswa, for the Ford Foundation, the same question.
Thanks, Kathy. I think the current crisis has really tested our previous practices around how we support partners, and has really challenged us. And I think a lot of the practices that we've had to adapt with the current pandemic, including trusting partners a bit more, providing a bit more flexibility in terms of discretion when it comes to the grants, are really some of the practices that we need to stick with going forward, and they need to stay with us, because I think it's been very evident that we need to be more deliberate about building resilience within organizations. And as long as we are focused on programs without necessarily providing support to build systems and processes within organizations to build their resilience, which enables them to respond better to disasters, because this is not the last disaster we're going to be faced with. So I think it goes a long way in helping organizations build that internal resilience. So I hope that a lot of the practices that we've been pushed towards, that would really stay with us and stick with us, and that we continue to advocate for practices that really empower organizations and communities more to build their resilience.
Thanks, Knox. Vuyiswa?
Yeah. So Ford has been a huge advocate for general support. We've almost become evangelical about it. And as I was mentioning earlier, over 70% of our grants. So this is very different from about 3 years ago. About 3 years ago, we had about maybe 28% of our grants were general support, and in 3 years we increased that to 70%. And part of that was also influenced by a process that Ford started about 4 or 5 years ago, where we the trustees allowed the foundation to put about $1 billion towards what we call a build program. And the build program was really, as Knox was saying, geared towards building the resilience of organizations. So these were, larger and longer grants. So through the build program, we've made about 250 plus grants since then under the build program. And these are 5-year grants that are largely, and I mean, there are only 2 line items, budget line items for that: core support and general support. And core support is about institutional strengthening. And this is preceded by a process that, which does an organizational mapping that then decides, what organizations need. And on the basis of that first year process of doing this organizational mapping, the core support of the grant would then go towards those institutional strengthening requirements. And the general support is really that for anything. So this has given people the flexibility, because people don't have to be always stressing about where is the next salary, bill going to be funded from. And it's made a huge difference in the fields that we're supporting through that. And this is something that is continuing. We continue to push for more general support, both internally and with our peers in the field.
Thank you, Vuyiswa. And I think, Nomvula, maybe it's how we selected our panelists, but certainly we've got great examples here of organizations that have changed their behavior and are planning to keep those changes in place going forward. And I think for those funders that aren't providing the more flexible and the general funding and supporting the building of resilience and the strengthening of organizations, there's some, Ford's provided a great example of how you can switch in 3 years from 28% of your funding being unrestricted to over 70%. So yeah, let's hope that we can influence more funders, and that other funders who are not on our panel can also take some of these practices forward. There's 2 questions here, one for Sarah and one for Knox, related to data. So I'm going to ask those ones together. Sarah, this one's from Soraya. So, you mentioned topping up existing partners with extra cost demands like data and cleaning. What responses have you found from non-profit partners about the barrier to the exorbitant cost of data, which is prohibiting them from working? And the one for Knox was around how the limitations around access to the internet impacted your online education programs. So I'll start with Sarah, but both of these relating to access to internet, exorbitant data costs.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, the response that we've received has been that this has been a huge barrier to NPOs being able to continue their work or to continue working in a different way. So the response has been one of frustration and disappointment and anger, even from NPOs, around how impossible it is to continue their work when they have to spend so much on data. And I know that the DG Murray Trust have been doing a lot of work to try and zero rate various platforms and working with the telcos to reduce the costs of data. And I also know that in projects where we've been involved with, especially where there have been bursaries provided to learners who have had to go home and try to work remotely, that bursary support has included specific data top-up costs. So I think data is the data cost is a huge issue to being able to respond and work during this pandemic.
Thanks, Sarah. And then Knox, how you found that this has impacted how you were saying your education programs have had to shift?
I think with our partner, Sarah, they were quite open right at the beginning of the initiative to say we're going to explore various channels. We're going to explore radio, we're going to explore TV, WhatsApp, etc. So it was a multi-channeled approach that they were working with, and really testing as you go along. As you progress, you really get to understand where learners have the most access. And I mean, without a doubt, access to the internet continues to be a huge barrier, both because of infrastructure as well as the data costs that Sarah has mentioned. So as and when the program was being rolled out, the partner was adjusting and really gravitating towards the channels that were getting the most access and that were more accessible, more easily accessible. And I think to Sarah's point earlier, I think this is really an opportunity for us to really, as donors and as a sector as a whole, to come together with an advocacy voice when we tackle the big audacious goals, such as making digital learning widely accessible. We understand the benefits, but the barriers are just so big, and they're right there. So how do we then collectively advocate with the telcos for more access and better access and cheaper rates and zero rates on platforms, especially platforms for learning? So I think we shouldn't necessarily lose sight of the advocacy components that goes hand in hand with the work that we do. We should always be trying to respond to the immediate need, but really understanding how do we then bring on the advocacy voice, which will really bring sustainability, long-term sustainability into the game for us all, as opposed to just really focusing on data only. But I think that's an important component for me, that as donors, we need to collaborate on and really collectively advocate for.
Thanks, Knox. Yeah, you're definitely speaking our language there with, supporting the need and the response, but also looking at advocacy for, how do we make this more accessible going forward. Okay, there's a question here that's got quite a few likes from Anthony Roberts for Sarah, and this is asking you to look into a bit of a crystal ball. Going forward, do you see a greater focus on funding social enterprises and capacitating youth to enter the formal economy, or do you see a greater focus on supporting education?
That's a great question. If I can just put the social enterprise element to one side and look at the kind of youth into work versus supporting the education system, the kind of grade 1 to grade 12. I think funders that have always supported the education system and know the education system will continue to support the education system, or that, formal education. I think there's going to be enormous need into the future. And I think, funders are already thinking about the impact into 2021 and beyond, and certainly should be thinking about the impact on, say, grade 11 learners going into matric next year, and the knock-on effects of all the lost time. So I think that will happen. However, I have seen that there are some very significant funders that are looking very seriously at NEETs, the not employment educational training, and looking at youth unemployment in particular, which we know is probably at about 50% between 15 and 25-year-olds, and it's only going to be worse once the figures are tallied, when we get through this pandemic. So I think there are, I know of at least 3 or 4 foundations that are really looking very seriously at how we can transition youth into employment. There has been, and in doing that, really trying to work on supporting better research around what is happening there, understanding where the opportunities are in terms of skills development and apprenticeships and things like that. So I think, there certainly is a focus on it. And as we see the numbers of youth unemployment really, really looking horrific, I think more funders are going to turn their attention onto that. And then just briefly on the social enterprise thing, I think it's a difficult terminology and definition, actually. I think a lot of NPOs would consider themselves social enterprises. There is a continuum. You can have for-profits that are social enterprises. So, I think it's not necessarily how the thing is set up. It's often what they're doing and what their impact is. And the only thing I would say that in my experience around that is that foundations are often constrained by their trust deed in terms of what they can fund. So they are constrained in terms of supporting for-profits. They may be constrained in terms of being able to provide loans or take out investments in for-profits. And that's why you typically see foundations supporting a non-profit, an NPC or an NPO. rather than a for-profit. But you know, that whole idea of social enterprise is a deep one, and you know, I'm not sure if I've properly answered the question fully. It could take a bit more time, I think. But
thanks, Sarah. Yeah, you've touched on the education and the kind of meets and youth unemployment issues and how funders are thinking of them. I'm going to take two questions that are related and put them to Vuyiswa. And I think they've come, one from Catherine Masters and one from Prudence Masika. How do you balance, this is from Catherine, how do you balance wanting to respond quickly and with flexibility against the risk of abuse, especially with new organizations? And Prudence's was similar. As corporates, you know, how do you deal with corruption, which we've seen even at clinics? This question, how do you ensure, a similar question, how do we ensure that our support is used as it should be?
Okay, so for us, the swift response has largely been to existing partners. So these are organizations we've had relationships with for a very long time. We do regular checks, you know, site visits, virtually now that we can't visit people physically. So we really have not had much concerns. Of course, things could go wrong. I guess grant making is always a leap of faith in any case. So you can never be 100% sure that money will not be abused. But I think we have relative comfort and confidence that these are our existing partners. We've had long-term relationships with them, and we do not anticipate that they would use this money any differently to how they've been using Ford funds so far. Yeah.
Thanks, Vuyiswa. I'm going to take two more questions from this list before we move to our closing statements. I think, and Sarah's touched on the social enterprise one. Sorry, there's one here which I want to finish with, so I'm just finding one before that. Okay, so this one's from Taryn Casey, and it's how are philanthropists thinking about funding in 2021? Do you think it will be continued COVID relief? No, it's just moved. And what should education NPOs or other NPOs be doing in terms of planning for 2021? Should we be scaling back? Should we be scaling up, etc.? So a tricky question, I think. I'm going to hand it first over to Knox.
Thanks, Kathy. I think in terms of what education or NPOs that have a focus on education could be focusing on as they prep for the next cycle in 2021. I think for me, I've always felt that we need to be utilizing this time to really invest in ourselves as organizations for nonprofits, to ensure that we remain relevant and our programs remain relevant, and that we're actually able to deliver through alternative channels. If you've had a huge dependency on face-to-face contact and delivering your programs, how do you then reinvent yourself as an organization? And I think this is the opportunity and the time now, because we're not sure how long the virus is going to linger around for. Is it going to be another 2 years, or is it going to be another 5 years before we have a successful vaccine? And then what does that mean? Does it mean everything comes to a grinding halt until then, as we dabble in and out of school and lockdown periods and so forth? So I think we really need to use the opportunity to rethink and reinvent and redesign some of our programs, to say, how do we make them future fit? And how do we, and it talks to that building resilience that I mentioned earlier on. So I think, and part of the planning really needs to start looking at opportunities of how else can we do what we do, given the current environment and potentially different other scenarios going forward. So I think that needs to be something that organizations focus on. And I think it brings donors into the conversation as well, because it does require resources. It requires research in some instances. It requires systems, investing in systems and processes. and all of that capacity. And so I think organizations need to be really engaging their donors during this time, as opposed to wait and see approach, as to how do we then reinvent ourselves and what is required, what is the support that we need. And I think donors would be open to that kind of conversation, but the organizations need to lead with it. Because as I said earlier, no one really knows how long the virus is going to linger for. And we can't wait and see and hope. We really need to be proactive in terms of the next phase.
Thanks, Nog. So, I mean, I guess, you know, responding to the question saying, as an organization, go to the funders, you know, rather than basing it on their funding, but what do you need? What do you need to adjust your programs? What do you need to become more resilient, and have those discussions? I'm taking the last question now from the audience, just to say that we will respond to those that haven't been responded to live after the session, and that we can distribute the answers. This one's from Grace Karondi to Sarah. Do you foresee social impact models taking nonprofits into a more sustainable economic position? And is this feasible given the current NPO policy framework? So I think since you've been talking about social enterprises, you've got more questions coming in on that one.
Okay. Kathy, I think if we're looking at the sustainability of NPOs, I really would encourage the management of NPOs and funders and the associations that support those ecosystems to really talk about, in the same way as Visa and Knox have also mentioned, you know, it's incumbent on both kind of both the NPO and the funders to understand what it means for that particular NPO to be sustainable. And certainly in a constrained funding environment, which I think 2021 will be, and into the future, if we have a look at what's happening in the economy, okay, we're going to have to tighten our belts, and we're going to have to be cleverer about how we use our resources. But I don't think we can understand an NPO sustainability if the NPO hasn't got a grip on what it means by its own sustainability and starts to engage in really deep and meaningful conversations with its various funders about how they can realize that particular outcome. You know, the social impact story and the social impact bonds is there and it's growing, but it's a complex world. To be an NPO involved in a social impact bond requires a lot of moving parts, a lot of contracting, and quite a lot of sophisticated outcomes-based, you know, monitoring and contracting. So I'm not so sure that social impact or social impact bonds are the only route to go in terms of creating sustainability. But I definitely think that conversation, the nexus between the funders and the NPOs to really unpick what it means for an NPO to be sustainable, given what it does and given the environment, is the most important thing that can happen.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, we're going to start our closing statements. So I'm going to start with Vuyiswa. And just given our audience of largely corporates and non-profit organizations, what recommendations would you have for them as we emerge from this crisis?
Sure. I think the one for all of us is that we're gonna, because this is a new world for all of us, right? And we can't be stuck in our old ways of doing things. And some of the things we've been doing may become irrelevant. So we need to be nimble, flexible, and listen. You know, I think the responsibility I've given myself as somebody who works for a grant-making organization is listening more, which is what I've been doing for the past few months. And I want to continue to do that because we can't afford to get it wrong. So we have to be responsive to what's happening. But our responsiveness is also dependent on the responsiveness of the people we support, which is the nonprofit sector. So I would encourage, more nimbleness on, for both sectors, and really more flexibility, and allow ourselves to be sometimes to be vulnerable and admit that we don't know. But let's all be ready for the new world, because as everybody keeps saying, we do have an opportunity, to kind of reframe the world as we know it.
Thank you, Lisa, for that positive statement and for the reminder about listening. I think it's really important. Knox, I'll hand over to you to answer the same question.
I think for me, Kathy, it's become very evident. I mean, Sarah spoke to the tough economic environment, which is anticipated to persist for some time, and businesses under pressure, which means naturally CSI budgets are going to be under pressure for some time. I think for me, really, it is an opportunity for corporates to really reflect, how do we support non-profits and communities and build their own internal resilience? We have limited funding, and that's a fact. And so how do we strategically deploy that funding that is available to really invest in building that resilience? How do we work with our partners to embrace technology, to embrace innovation? And I think that really talks to taking a bit more risk than we have in the past. And I think technology and innovation go hand in hand. And I think those could be real game changers for the sector when we talk about long-term sustainability. And we all need to embrace that, and we all need to support that. And support the new ideas, encourage our partners to explore innovation and to explore technology, but we need to support that, because somebody needs to support that. So I think it is really about thinking and reflecting, thinking hard and reflecting about that resilience. I think we need to focus on that capacity, providing that flexibility, and really just extending a bit more trust to our partners, and work with them in a true partnership way. So I think for me, those are some of the sort of highlights that I would really like us as corporate to really reflect on going forward from this pandemic.
Thanks, Knox. Some more great messages coming out there around looking at resilience and innovation as we go forward, and a greater partnership, which I guess speaks back to the listening point that Lisa made. And Sarah, over to you.
I feel like a lot of it has already been covered, so I'll be brief. But if I were in the corporate funder's shoes, I would first really try and understand from my own business what the funding flows are likely to be. I think you've got to have a really strong grip on your budgets, because the worst thing that you can do for your reputation is overcommit and underdeliver with NPOs. So know how much you can spend or how much your budget has been reduced, and start understanding and communicating that early. And also I think everybody should be re-strategizing, even if it's a quick and dirty re-strategize, because the world has shifted and you can't even begin to pretend that what you've been doing 6 months ago has got much relevance now, at least delivered in the same way. So you have to re-strategize and replan. And if I were in the MPO shoes, I would say the same thing. Keep strategizing and planning very carefully. And I would be really trying to cost save in a pretty extreme way, because I think budgets will be under huge pressure. And then I would really, I think we all should be talking more to each other, to Knox's point and to Buisa's point, more talking and more listening, to get to know this particular situation and context of your partners, whether it's your funding partner or your NPO partner, in order to build that trust, because you can't build trust without knowing. You have to, really understand the context and the particularities of that place to build the trust. And then I think you can see some really great, innovative and strong collaborations emerging from this time.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think you've reinforced what our other panelists have said and added the, for corporates and nonprofits, the need to re-strategize. And that's certainly something we've seen from our side at Trialogue, and which we're trying to support companies to do, is to do the quick and dirty re-strategizing of CSI strategies, given the constraints that they're now facing and the increased needs. So a huge thank you to all three of our panelists. I think you've provided wonderful insights this morning. Appreciate your time, your experience. It sounds like your organizations are doing great things. We can share certainly some of the details when we send out the notes from this, which we will share with all the delegates. And just to finish off, let me just say, to remind everyone, this has been recorded. We will be putting the presentation as well as the recording onto the Trialogue Knowledge Hub. I encourage you all to visit that site. There's a lot more information on that. Thanks to Nedbank Private Wealth for sponsoring that site on philanthropy. Again, the virtual conference, 13th and 14th of October, registration is open. So you can see that on our website. And yeah, our Business and Society Handbook, well in the thick of things. And if you haven't participated in the research, please do. Thanks to everyone who signed in this morning. Thank you for your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but as I said, we will respond to you afterwards, and we will be sending through the email to everyone that signed up. So thanks, panelists, and thanks, audience, and yeah, hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.